Hey guys, this is Imaginary Axiom. Welcome back to the second part of Ecology, where we will be looking at carbon cycle. For the carbon cycle, we'll be looking at the following components: carbon fixation, cellular respiration, aquatic ecosystems, methane, fossil fuels, and the effects of human activities. Alright, let's get on with the video. So recall that the Earth is comprised of four spheres: the atmosphere, which is basically the air, the lithosphere, which is basically the ground, the hydrosphere, which is basically the water or any sort of aquatic area, and then the biosphere, which consists of all the living things, such as organisms as well as plants. So the carbon cycle refers to the movement of carbon between all four of these spheres. There is no first and last step in the carbon cycle since it is a continuous process. However, we're just going to be starting off with the atmosphere and how that results in carbon fixation. Now, carbon is in the atmosphere, and it is mainly in the form of carbon dioxide, also known as CO2, or methane, also known as CH4. Now, as we know from the last video, the lithosphere consists of autotrophs which produce their own food via photosynthesis. A key component of this process is carbon. Thus, carbon fixation is the process of autotrophs converting CO2 into carbon compounds such as carbohydrates. By absorbing the CO2 from the atmosphere, it decreases the concentration of CO2 and therefore carbon in general. While we humans obtain oxygen via ventilation, plants don't exactly do that. During the process of photosynthesis, autotrophs use carbon to create their own food. In doing so, decreases the concentration of carbon dioxide within them, and thus creates a concentration gradient between themselves and the atmosphere. Now, because of this gradient, CO2 therefore diffuses from the atmosphere or the hydrosphere into the autotrophs, which are part of the biosphere. We will get into the hydrosphere later on in the video. Now, one of the products obtained from photosynthesis is oxygen, which is what autotrophs release back into the atmosphere and what organisms such as us humans absorb in. The opposite of carbon fixation refers to the release of carbon into the atmosphere. With regards to organism, this refers to two processes: cellular respiration and ventilation. Now, cellular respiration is the process of converting chemical energy contained in nutrients into ATP, which is what cells use in order to function. Now, this process in return releases waste products such as carbon dioxide. In simple terms, carbon dioxide is released by the cells and diffused into veins. These blood vessels carry the CO2 back to the lungs where ventilation occurs. Now, ventilation refers to the exhalation of carbon dioxide and the inhalation of oxygen. Thus, through the mutualistic relationship between autotrophs and heterotrophs within the biosphere, the ability of the atmosphere and therefore biosphere to maintain the carbon levels is preserved. Now, carbon in the hydrosphere, i.e. the aquatic atmosphere, is slightly more complicated. In such ecosystems, carbon is present as dissolved carbon dioxide and hydrogen carbonate ions. CO2 is soluble in water, which means that it can remain in water as a dissolved gas. It therefore also has the ability to combine with water to form carbonic acid, also known as H2CO3. So what essentially happens is you have carbon dioxide as a gas which mixes with water and therefore forms carbonic acid. Now, carbonic acid, also known as H2CO3, can dissociate to form hydrogen and hydrogen carbonate ions. So H2CO3 can then dissociate into HCO3 with a negative charge and hydrogen ions. Now, both dissolved carbon dioxide and hydrogen carbonate ions are absorbed by the aquatic autotrophs. So these organisms then use the ions and compounds in order to make carbohydrates and other carbon compounds. The release of hydrogen ions explains why CO2 levels have the ability to reduce pH. While carbon dioxide is essential for aquatic autotrophs, increasing CO2 levels within the atmosphere means that more CO2 is going to diffuse into aquatic ecosystems. This results in the ongoing decrease of the ocean's pH, also known as power of hydrogen. and therefore this entire process is known as ocean acidification. Essentially, the ocean itself contains carbon ions, also known as CO3 with a negative, which is absorbed by the corals to create calcium carbonate, CaCO3, which is used to create their own shells. Hydrogen ions decrease the amount of carbon ions in the ocean by combining with it in order to form bicarbonate. Hence, the levels of hydrogen ions must be kept low to ensure that there is sufficient amount of carbonate ions for aquatic organisms. If not, their shells will be thinner and therefore weaker. As I mentioned before, besides CO2, the atmosphere also consists of methane, CH4. Now, methane is produced as a waste product from organisms who live in anaerobic conditions. Such conditions lack a supply of oxygen. So organisms who produce methane are known as methanogens, and the process of producing methane is known as methanogenesis. There are a series of reactions performed by other organisms before methanogenesis can occur. Now, within the anaerobic environment live bacteria, who have the ability to convert matter into products such as alcohol, hydrogen, and CO2. Other bacteria under the same conditions use these products in order to produce acetate, CO2, and hydrogen. Finally, methanogens have the required reactants to produce methane via methanogenesis. They do this by two chemical reactions. The first, they can use acetate to produce methane and carbon dioxide, and the second is they can use carbon dioxide and hydrogen in order to produce methane and water. So the screen shows the chemical equations for both reactions. Now, when methane is released into the atmosphere, it will last for about 12 years because it will naturally oxidize into CO2 and H2O. Aside from cellular respiration, fossil fuels also have the ability to contribute to CO2 levels. Now, fossil fuels are made from remains of past organisms. However, before fossil fuels are even formed, such as coal, peat is formed. Now, peat formation refers to when organic matter, such as plants or animals, are not fully decomposed. This is due to anaerobic conditions in waterlogged soil. So, waterlogged soil is basically an environment or like a condition where it is highly concentrated or filled with water. Now, regardless of the environment, all organic matter is eventually digested by saprotrophs who obtain oxygen from air packets within the soil itself. Now, as I mentioned before, sometimes water is unable to drain out of the environment, so it becomes waterlogged, and therefore the results in anaerobic conditions. The spaces no longer contain enough oxygen, which means that saprotrophs are no longer able to survive. This results in the accumulation of large quantities of partially decomposed matter, which is compressed over a long period of time to form a dark brown acidic material, which is known as peat. Peat formation then leads to the creation of coal. Coal is formed when deposits of peat are buried under other sediments. These layers are compressed and heated for a long period of time. The pressure and heat force out impurities and moisture from the peat, making the remaining material extremely concentrated with carbon and eventually turns into coal. Now, the method in which fossil fuels can contribute to CO2 levels is due to the process of combustion. When compounds rich in hydrocarbons are heated in the presence of oxygen, it will get lit and burn. This entire process is known as a combustion reaction. The products of a complete combustion reaction include CO2, carbon dioxide, and water, H2O. While humans are beneficial to the environment, they can also be harmful to it. Human activities affect CO2 levels a lot. The clearing of trees, known as deforestation, not only releases CO2 during the entire process, but also decreases the number of autotrophs, once again increasing CO2 levels. The burning of fossil fuels through the use of cars, for example, also plays a role in increasing CO2. With increasing CO2 levels and other greenhouse gases, results in the increase of global temperature. As a result, large quantities of methane stored in Arctic ice caps can be released. These ongoing activities and processes create a feedback loop and will only continue to negatively affect the environment unless action is taken. Anyways, that's all for this video, guys. Comment down below if you have any questions or comments and we'll surely get back to you. Be sure to check out the last biology video on ecology and other videos in other subjects. Stay tuned for upcoming biology videos. We'll be looking at other cycles that are present on Earth, such as phosphorus and nitrogen. Toodles!